Golden State Media Concepts SciFi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts SciFi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome, listeners, to the Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. Now, the episode description and title, we have put that we are talking a little bit about swords and sorcery today. And what I mean by that is we're going to be talking to you guys a little bit about the genre of fantasy. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is a science fiction podcast, Shay. How does fantasy have anything to do with science fiction? Well, let me tell it to you. Now, I had a friend from college who always said that science fiction and fantasy are basically the same thing. The only thing that is drawing the line between them is technology versus magic. Now, in the world of fantasy, a lot of times we get very similar structures and very similar ideas that sci-fi has, but done in a different setting. Now, the setting really doesn't matter as much. It's just with fantasy, technology and magic aren't explained. Now, things aren't explained as well in fantasy. In science fiction, we focus a little bit more on the details. So there's a lot more explanation in science fiction than there is in fantasy. So the way that he said it best, this is my friend Zach Manning, he said that fantasy is just science fiction without the explanation. And a lot of times you'll get some pretty cool stuff, like in the video games The Witcher, you'll get things like they'll be talking about scientific things that we know about today, like evolution and that sort of thing, that weren't even a theory back in the Middle Ages. But because they rely on magic as opposed to technology, they might have a better understand. They might have a similar understanding of science, so to speak, than we do. It's just that their technology hasn't evolved because they don't need it, because magic kind of solves that the need to fix things and kind of, in a sense, peaks technology because they don't need to improve if there's magic, so to speak. Now, one of the things that I kind of want to talk about before we get into things, I'm going to break this down into a news segment of the show, and then we're going to go talk about barbarian movies, swords and sorcery, and that sort of thing, and then we're going to get off into like actual high-end fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and that sort of thing. So you guys aren't going to want to miss this one.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA Podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. Now, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you guys about, and I just discovered this recently, there is a new place to get all the science fiction that you might want or need in your life. Or do you feel like there's kind of like a void? I know a lot of times in my life I feel like, man, there just isn't enough science fiction to watch. There's not enough good stuff coming out to keep my appetite wet. And I've seen a lot of stuff from, back in the day, all the good stuff, all the classics and that sort of thing. And a lot of times what's being released today, I think some good things are being released today, and I think some really bad things are being released today. But one of the things that you can do now is there is an indie sci-fi channel that resides online that you can go and check out some independent films. And it's actually kind of cool. It's called Recursor.tv. It's completely web-driven, but I'm sure you can bring it up on your Xbox or, a Blu-ray player or that sort of thing. thing. It's formatted really well, so that way it seems like in the future development or whatever that they can pull it into other mediums. Now, it's www.recursor.tv, and it features content from independent filmmakers that include subgenres such as military science fiction, artificial life, augmented reality, time travel, space operas. They've got noir. They've got one of my personal favorites, cyberpunk, and all of that good stuff just wrapped up into one. And now most of this content, I know there are a few films on here, a few feature films and that sort of thing, but the thing that it focuses most on is web series. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with web series, but web series are a really good way to cut the cord. They're usually 5 to 10 minutes long. There's a lot of stuff out there. Journey Quest is pretty good. There's Harem Quest and all that good stuff. Now, this is kind of a platform to be pushing just sci-fi things. Now, I don't know if you guys have been like cruising around YouTube for web series of sci-fi, but there's oftentimes a lot of garbagey type stuff on there, and it's really hard to sift through the garbage on YouTube, and I think this is a really good source to kind of find good science fiction-y things that you can watch. And the CEO of Recursor himself has said that this is the golden era of hard science fiction. We are thrilled to be premiering the first video platform devoted to the genre, and I have to say I'm thrilled that this is something that is existing. Independent films, I don't know if you guys have watched too many of them, especially in the sci-fi genre, are kind of pushing boundaries. Now the technology that we have as filmmakers and that sort of thing, it's so in the public, anyone can get their hands on it. That means that it's not just the big boys down in LA. They're not the only ones making the good content anymore. And so I think it's cool that things like this exist. And I say if you're into this sort of thing, if you like web series and that sort of thing, I would definitely check it out. Now, one of the things they have on there that I think is the thing that they're promoting the most is called Nina Unlocked. And it is a web series about I guess she was an assassin robot that she's going and interviewing people and trying to figure out her past because her memory's erased or something like that. Honestly, I watched a couple episodes of it. I'm not super impressed. The cinematography is okay. I think the special effects are kind of nice, but I can really see that they lack a budget. And I know that, you know, web series often do lack a budget, but I can only handle so much. And I can only handle so much of, you know, oh, we're just kind of dragging things on. We're just kind of pushing things out kind of quickly. And I feel like a little bit more time needs to be put into this. But one of the ones that I did see that I actually really did enjoy, it's a cyberpunk film called From the Future with Love. And it goes around this whole idea of, you know, in the future, you have kind of like plans that you can get for your police officers. So like you get like a security plan, like a police coverage plan, like you would like health insurance or like you would with phone insurance or phone service and that sort of thing. So there's like the basic plan, the middle of the line plan, and like the premium plan and that sort of thing. So like in the opening, it kind of shows a police officer walking by and there's somebody getting killed or somebody getting hurt and that sort of thing. And he just walks by them because she doesn't even have coverage. And then there's like a scene where these police officers are in a diner and this guy like dines and dashes. And the waitress is like, well, hey guys, aren't you going to do anything about this? And then they so they use like an eyepiece and they can like scan her coverage and it says that they don't have enough coverage. And they're like, no, we can't because you don't have the coverage. And I think it's kind of a good a social commentary on the whole medical system, on the, you know, like on these coverage type plans that are kind of plaguing our society at the moment. It's a pretty good film. I highly recommend it. The special effects are amazing, and I really do appreciate the time that they put into the costumes. That's something that can make or break a film for me, is set design. So the website is Recursor TV. Now, I've seen things like this kind of come and go. I'm kind of hoping that this sticks around. I know I'm going to be checking it out in the future. I love web series websites, and I think you guys should all get on board with this. All right, so I'm going to drop some news on you guys that's a little hysterical. I don't know what you guys feel about Stephen King. I'm going to talk a little bit about him right now. Now, Stephen King has officially announced that he is releasing a young reader's children's book. It will be coming out on November 22nd. It is called Charlie the Choo Choo, written by Stephen King. It will be his first and last children book. We'll see about that. Every time somebody says that they're doing like their first and last things, you know, I'm kind of I don't believe it. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of times people will be like, this is the last movie in the series, and then they just keep going. Well, maybe Stephen King will do so well with this children's book that he'll just keep going. But anyway, back to the point. It's called Charlie the Choo-Choo, and it is a book that follows the adventures of engineer Bob, who has a secret. His train engine, Charlie the Choo-Choo, is alive, and also his best friend. Charlie the Choo-Choo is a story about friendship, loyalty, and hard work. And this is from the man that gave you The Shining, which is also kind of about friendship, loyalty, and hard work. So, I'm very interested to see what this is. I'm probably going to go and buy it just for kicks and giggles, because Stephen King, I like his writing a lot. I don't like the miniseries that they put out, and I like it when other people direct his work. He does seem to have a few tropes that he always goes into, like kind of regurgitating some of the same content over and over again. But I think this is kind of interesting. I never thought I would live in a world where Stephen King wrote a children's book. It's very interesting. I think it's going to give us some kicks. On that note as well, it looks like they are finally going to be releasing The Dark Tower in 2017. Not exactly sure when, but I don't know if you guys know anything about the history of Dark Tower. Stephen King's like magnum opus, as some people say, a series of books based around a lot of the stuff that happens in like all of his books, really. It's kind of loosely all tied together in some sort of way with the Dark Tower series. Now, they're finally releasing it as a film. If you're not familiar with The Dark Tower, then you should probably go check it out. It's very good. It's probably his best work. And I really appreciate it. I think you guys will too. Now, J.J. Abrams was said to direct it at one point. Thank God. I don't know. I'm kind of off the J.J. Abrams bandwagon at this point. After watching Star Trek II, I think I realized that I didn't really like the first one all that much anyway. And then seeing what they did to Khan, like, I don't know. Like, think about it right now, guys. Like, can you remember anything about Star Trek Into Darkness? No, you can't. I can't. We can't. And then I liked his Star Wars, but I'm really with South Park on this one, where they said it best, honestly, that yes, it had things we liked, and yes, it had things we wanted, but it was basically the first film regurgitated all over again, which I guess is what we all really wanted anyway, which I think he's right. I think it's a good start to the series, but I don't think it is the supreme ultimate movie. Like, after the movie ended, I had friends like saying that was their new favorite Star Wars movie, and I'm like, what's wrong with you? Empire Strikes Back is hands down the best Star Wars movie. I'm getting a little bit tired of J.J. Abrams like just making the same thing but with a shiny new tinfoil hat on it. Now, Ron Howard was also supposed to direct it. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ron Howard, but Ron Howard was Opie from the Andy Griffith Show. I know it's been a while since then, and he's done a lot of work, but he will always be remembered for Opie. I'm kind of glad that he didn't get his hands on it. I don't know if you've seen his work. It's good, but I don't think it's good enough for The Dark Tower. And right now we've got Nikolai Arkel. And I think if anybody's going to be able to push this movie forward, it will be Nikolai. I'm actually kind of looking forward to it myself. So Sony Pictures is the one that's going to be releasing it, and it will be coming out next year. So hopefully it'll be good. And on that note, we're going to cut to a break. When we get back, I'm going to talk to you guys about some Swords and Sorcery, which you've all been waiting for.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch, whatever it may be.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. I am Shay Northrop, your host and guide through this quest that we are about to take on Swords and Sorcery. Now, I want to talk a little bit about fantasy as a genre of science fiction in and of itself a little bit later, but my favorite subgenre of fantasy is probably the Swords and Sorcery barbarian movie subgenre. Now, I remember when I was first introduced to the genre, my dad dusted off our old VHS player. I guess at this time VHS was still the king, so to speak. Like, VHS took forever to die. So we had a VHS player, and he popped in Conan the Explorer, or Conan the Barbarian, and was like, enjoy. And I remember like my eyes lighting up like right from the first scene of them forging the sword, and then the bad guys come in and go and like kill his family and chop off it. Like, there's this really interesting scene where James Earl Jones is like looking into Conan's mother's eyes, and like you seem to feel this sort of connection between them, and then James Earl Jones just like chops her head off, and like Conan's on the ground with her mom's head. And it's a crazy movie, and probably I shouldn't have seen it as young as I did, but I really enjoyed that movie. Now, this wasn't my first introduction to the fantasy genre, just the introduction to barbarians movies, so to speak. My first introduction to like the fantasy genre was probably like Dragonheart, which I thought was really cool as a kid, but then seeing Conan the Barbarian, I was enthralled. Now, if you're not familiar with Conan the Barbarian, it was kind of one of those pulp novels back in the 1930s. It was first released in Weird Tales, 1932, and it was invented by Robert E. Howard, who is actually one of the greatest pulp novelists in existence. If you really want to read some fun, high fantasy, high adventure, and that sort of thing, I would definitely go and check out some of his work. I have a collection of the Conan the Barbarian like writings and short stories from the era, and they are a treat. They really are. I don't know about you guys, but I am really into this whole high fantasy, go on the quest, and that sort of thing. And you know, like, I think, you know, people give this genre a little bit of bad credit. Like, I know it's it's pretty cheesy and it doesn't get made a lot today, but I think that people don't really treat it with enough respect that it deserves, because honestly, it is really hard to make a fantasy film. If you're trying to make somebody believe in magic and that sort of thing, like, the first thing you think of is that's lame. If you're able to pull it off, well, I think that that's quite an achievement. Now, Conan the Barbarian came out in 1982, and it was one of the first, like, Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. And I think he did a pretty good job playing the part, although Conan in the comic books and the novel was a lot more intelligent as a person. I think Conan pulls off the look really well, and I think he's charismatic enough to where it's actually pretty good. It also features Mako, if you're familiar with him, James Earl Jones, and a couple other people. Now, I really enjoyed Conan the Barbarian. Another film that really spoke to me was the sequel, Conan the Destroyer. And Conan the Destroyer is not a good film by any means, but there's something about it that, you know, just carried over from the first one, and it's just something to enjoy. I think one of my favorite scenes in the movie, in the first one, he gets spat on by a camel, and he punches the camel in the face. And then in the next movie, he's like riding by a camel, and he's like, "I'm sorry." I don't know. I thought it was really funny. The second Conan the Barbarian kind of focuses a little bit more on the adventure side of things, whereas the first Conan the Barbarian was more focused on revenge. The whole movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger is trying to get revenge on James Earl Jones, and that's kind of where he goes through. And a lot of these barbarian movies have that thing. A lot of times in a barbarian movie, you've got our hero who was a part of these barbarian groups or this tribe or this village or something, and then some guys come in, mess things up, and then he has to go in and put on the armor, put on the sword, and go and fight him for revenge purposes, for his land, that sort of thing. Another good example of that is the film The Barbarians that came out in 1987. Now, at this point, barbarian movies were kind of starting to go on the decline, and we don't really see any past the 90s at all. And I think that's a shame. Now, Barbarians was a movie about Italian barbarian movie about two brothers, Kuchak and Gore, and they were a part of this like traveling circus. And this king of this land like kidnaps the ringleader, who is a lady, and kidnaps the two brothers, and they're like little twins. And so, like, one of the coolest things about this movie, now, After the second half, it's not as good. But like in the first half, they're being trained to fight each other. Like, so they would, one of the guards would put on a black helmet and go and like beat the kid and like torture him and that sort of thing. So the barbarian learns to hate the guy with the black helmet. And then the other brother who is separated, they would put on a gold helmet and torture him. And that sort of thing caused this hate between like the black helmet and the gold helmet, and they would do whatever they could to kill the person in that helmet. So they put them in a cage, and it's actually kind of funny. It's kind of like a Thunderdome type thing where they give them swords and they put on the helmet and they make them fight. Well, there are all these people standing around the cage like watching, and some of them have their hands in there, and like there's a scene where one of the guys gets his hands chopped off, and I'm like, if there's a sword fight going on in the cage, guys, don't put your hands in the cage. Anyway, it's a lot of fun, it's a lot of fun. The movie itself is really cheesy. The special effects are god-awful, but if you are into that kind of thing, the high adventure thing, I think The Barbarians is a really fun movie. After they get out of the prison, though, I don't think it's as good, and the ending is a little anticlimactic, but what can you expect, man? It was the 80s. And another film that came out kind of similar, The Red Sonja. Not as big of a fan of this. I don't understand how the Red Sonja became a barbarian heroine, because originally she was a gunfighter, like a warrior in modern times. She was also involved in Robert E. Howell's writings, and she was like a warrior woman with guns. I don't know how she got into the Conan universe, but somewhere along the lines it got picked up, and they made a movie about her too. And it's basically a very similar to Conan. Conan even shows up in it. She's been wronged, and she has to go and stop the person who wrongs her. A lot of barbarian movies are actually revenge films, if you really think about it. Now, one of the things that I think people have the biggest problem with them is they think that the movies in of themselves are a little bit misogynistic. And yeah, I guess a little bit. They're very man-type movies, very machismo in essence. And in all honesty, I don't think there's anything wrong with machismo films, but they definitely... A lot of barbarian movies, and not all of them, but a lot of them do involve a strong female character that doesn't really need their help, that helps them, more or less. A lot of times you get, like in Conan the Destroyer, you had Grace Jones, who played a warrior woman with a staff. Oh my gosh, she did great in that movie. Very tough female character, did not even really need Conan, was just kind of traveling with him because... he was the legendary warrior, and so she wanted to travel with him. One of my favorite scenes in the movie, one of the ladies who they have to save, a princess, so to speak, she's asking her, how do you get a man to notice you? How do you get a man to want you? Because she has a thing for Conan. And it's really funny. Like, her answer is, I take him. And I just love that. I think those movies are kind of given a little bit of, not enough credit that they deserve. So... if you ever get a chance, check them out. I really wish that they would make these today, and they've tried, and it's been a miserable failure. I'm just trying to. One of the things that I just don't understand is how we would be able to make these movies today, and them be not laughed at. That's the thing. You'd have to really do a good job and make it like edgy and like crazy, contrasty, and that sort of thing. But even at the same time, that's kind of become a trope in of itself. So you'd have to find a way to kind of take this genre to another level. And like I said, they've tried. There was a new Conan the Barbarian movie remake that came out in 2011, and honestly, it was just weird. Like, it wasn't weird in a good way. It was weird in a very... I don't know. I did not enjoy it at all. I know my dad did, and he's just kind of a fan of movies, I think. I don't think his tastes are quite as refined anymore, because there's a lot of things that he does watch that are a little bad, and this is one of them. I remember sitting down and watching this with him, and he was like, no, it's not bad. And I checked it out, and I was like, no, this is pretty bad. I would like to see a Conan movie done the way it's supposed to be. In the original Conan story, it was about a king who sat down and was talking, like, he was telling his tale. So it's implied that Conan himself embellished on all of his tales. Like, it's implied that Conan was a boastful man and didn't actually accomplish these things. And I think I would like to see that in the character of Conan in the near future, if they ever remake it again and just completely forget the 2011 one, as I have. And I would really like to see a little bit more development with these. But I think with a little bit of modern spin and the same basic adventure, the adventure story arc, I think we could get good high fantasy barbarian films. And on that note, when we come back, I'm going to talk to you guys about a little bit more contemporary fantasy. So stick around.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. I'm Shay Northrup, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about fantasy. Now, fantasy is a very broad word, right? I guess it's technically a subgenre of science fiction, but there are a lot of subgenres of that subgenre within the subgenre of fantasy. It's pretty crazy. It's just like music, right? You've got your punk rock, but then you got your post-punk, and then you know, it's a mess. But one of the things that I think is really important is to realize, and I'm going to reiterate this, I said it a little bit before, that fantasy is science fiction without explanation. So fantasy covers a lot of things. Your Harry Potter movies, I suppose, are considered fantasy. Your Twilight movies, I guess, are considered fantasy. But then you also get the good stuff, like Season of the Witch. You get stuff like Lord of the Rings, and you get a little bit of Game of Thrones. And we're going to talk about all of that today on this show. Now, one of the things that I guess kind of bugs me, and in the D&D world and the board gaming world, I play a lot of board games with some friends, and I play Dungeons and Dragons, which is probably why fantasy draws me in so much. Now, one of the things we say in the board game world is we have gateway games, right? Like, gateway games are like, it's like a play on the gateway drug term, where you play games like Spyfall or Ticket to Ride or even like Catan as a kind of gateway game to get them into more crazy games like Star Wars Empire Assault and that sort of thing. And I guess in a sense, these pre-teen fantasy movies that we're all seeing are kind of a gateway drug, kind of a gateway movie into real hardcore good fantasy or good science fiction. So I don't really have too much of a problem with these things existing if it means that I can get more people to watch stuff like Alien, if I can get more people to watch stuff like Blade Runner, if I can get more people into kind of, not a higher culture of science fiction, but maybe a little bit more adult type things, because I'm not a preteen. I grew out of that stuff pretty quick. I did enjoy the Harry Potter movies, but I am definitely not a fan of these Percy Jacksons. I am definitely not a fan of these Beautiful Creatures movies or any of that nonsense. Mrs. Pettigrews' Home for Peculiar Children was probably the worst movie I've ever seen. And I don't know. It's one of those things where you get really disappointed because you get directors like Tim Burton who are huge in fantasy, and then they start doing stuff like that. They start doing preteen angst films, and it kind of hurts my soul a little bit. Now, going back to fantasy, like I said, gateway drug. So hopefully these things like Percy Jackson will get people into things like Game of Thrones. And I think Game of Thrones is brilliant because it has captivated audiences across the nation and across the world and into a genre that a lot of people consider nerdy. And one of the ways that they do this that I think is just brilliant is they don't start it off so nerdy. I don't know if you've noticed this, but Game of Thrones starts off very We've got a little bit of action. We've got a lot of drama. We've got a lot of sex. We've got a lot of, this cool stuff like a night film, like less fantasy, more night film. And as the seasons go on, magic starts to become like a thing. And then as the thing goes on, dragons start to become a big thing, and all of a sudden we are in a fantasy world. The undead are walking, like we're in Lord of the Rings at this point. And I think that is the best way to go into it. Like, I know a lot of dungeon masters for D&D, and I'm sorry if I'm losing you guys on this one, but I have to bring up D&D when we start talking about fantasy. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to note about like a lot of dungeon masters is they do the same thing with D&D. They'll start off with areas with little magic, and you might be the only person that knows magic, but then by the end of the game, like, everybody's throwing fireballs at everybody, and everybody, like, just explosions everywhere, and it's good stuff. And I think that kind of easing people into the idea of magic and easing people into the idea of like these otherworldly creatures is probably the best way to go about it without people just looking at it and laughing. You know what I mean? Like, give us some setup. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, unfortunately, we do not get enough good high fantasy movies. And by high fantasy, I mean, I'm talking Game of Thrones, I'm talking Lord of the Rings, I'm talking that sort of thing, like Season of the Witch, those kind of movies, Ironclad. We don't get a lot of them. And when we do, I get really excited. And I know going into them, they're either going to be garbage or they're going to be great. But I think if people start using this rhythm, if people start using this momentum, right? This like, let's get the ball rolling before we start throwing fireballs. Let's get the ball rolling before we start all these sorcerers and magic just in your face. Because people do like magic, and even in those angsty tween movies or the Disney magic movies, like, people like magic, but there has to be an element of mystery. It can't play out like a game of D&D. It can't play out like a video game. You can't have scripted list of spells and they only work. Like, I was watching a movie where this guy, like, literally, he's at a door and they're like, can you use magic missile? Or it was some like attack, and he's like, no, I can't use any more spells today. And I'm like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? You guys are really sticking to the rules of like D&D for your movie? Like, come on. The real world doesn't work like that. All right? So don't make your movies like a video game. And I think that is a big problem a lot of fantasy movies have. And video games, too. Like, we could talk about video games as well. I think video games have kind of mastered the fantasy element a little bit better than movies have. And I think that's good, too, because with launches like The Witcher, with launches like Skyrim, with launches like that, we're kind of getting people more into this fantasy world. And I really enjoy it. I think it's good escapism, because a lot of times I watch movies to escape my everyday struggles, and I'm sure you all do, too. On that note, we are going to end the show. I am Shay Northrup here at Golden State Media Concepts Science Fiction Podcast. You can find us on Stitcher. You can find us on SoundCloud. You can find us on Google Play, YouTube. And don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Please let me know what you think. Did you enjoy the show? Did you not? Should I talk about fantasy a little bit more in the future? Should I not? Let us know. I really want to hear from you guys. Let's have a conversation. And on that note, stay saucy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts SciFi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.